today's broadcast of The Brew. So I am going to jump right in. Folk magic is a type of traditional esotericism practiced by individuals and communities and cultures, often passed down through generations. It involves the use of charms and spells and other rituals to achieve a desired outcome. So common folk magic practices include setting up protection spells, healing rituals, divination, protection rituals, and it's always in folk magic in general, in any culture, is born out of the struggles, the pain, and the suffering of oppressed people. We've seen that in hoodoo and Appalachian folk magic, Brujeria de Rancho, Roma, Santeria, and others. And that's certainly the case in Italian, Afro-Sicilian, and Mediterranean diasporic practices of folk magic as well. And on today's program, we're going to be joined by respected authors and practitioners and friends of mine, Mary Grace Fahrun and Dee Norman, who are going to join my amazing co-host, Michael Thérèse McQueen, and me for the hour discussing all things esoterica. And remember, this is a live and interactive show. So two things. One, please ask questions, share your comments, join the conversation, and be patient because it may take me a minute to get to the questions. Second, this is usually the only part of the show that I get to look right at the camera, because it's the only time I don't have to look at everything else that's happening in the studio space in order to put captions and things like that up. So know that I care about each one of you and I care about connecting with each one of you, but the rest of the time it's going to look like I'm looking at something on the floor. So let me go ahead and bring our guests in and my co-host into the room. And first, let me start by saying welcome to all of you. And for those who have been living under a rock, I suppose, who don't know who Dee Norman and Mary Grace Fahrun is, let's start off by having Dee go ahead and start first and tell us a little bit about your background, and we'll talk. I'm sure we'll talk about your book and Grace's book in a little bit.
Well, where to begin? I grew up in an Italian-American family in Louisville, Kentucky. We had very, very close ties to West Orange, New Jersey, where the bulk of my family resided. But we were the southern branch that decided to raise their children and have their family in Louisville, Kentucky. So that's where I grew up. My mother and grandmother taught me through allowing me to observe, and then much, much later allowing me to ask questions. An Italian-American folk practice that has been handed down through our family for who knows how many generations. I have been involved and interested in esoteric topics since I was about 11, and that's when my grandmother and mother gave me my first deck of tarot cards. And then last year my book did come out. It's called Burn a Black Candle, and that's a little capsule about who I am.
I was going to try and get that graphic up on the screen, but I'm a little bit slow. We'll get to that in a little bit. Grace, go ahead and tell us a little bit about you and your background and whatever else you want to share.
Okay, well, I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and I grew up in Montreal and Connecticut at the same time. My parents were both immigrants, Italian immigrants. They immigrated after World War II. And I grew up in a very Italian neighborhood, and where I was exposed to all this practice and stuff. And it just was the things that we do. In 1998, I hit the scene. I hit the internet with my website, Brew's Kitchen, where it was in response to some of the things I was seeing on the internet in the early days about Italian witchcraft and Italian folk magic. And I just wanted to put the message out there about what the practice was that I was growing up in, and so the rest is history, I guess. Oh, and my book was published 5 years ago. So it's coming up on 5 years in May.
Wow, that's awesome. And Michael, excuse me, for those who aren't familiar with how it is that you're part of this conversation, share a little bit about your background and how you came to be involved in Italian folk magic.
So for those who don't know me, I'm Thérèse McQueen, and I grew up here in New Jersey, and particularly in Hamilton, New Jersey, which was my first kind of exposure to really kind of Italian American life and Italian American spirituality. So Italian American spirituality really informed my youngest impressions of Catholicism and what it meant to be connected with the spiritual world. It wasn't later into life that I met my first mentor, Scott, who introduced me to Italian American folk magic from his family's practice from Sicily. And that became kind of the groundwork for my magical and esoteric practice as it is today. So that's kind of what has fed me and has enriched me through my journey into esotericism and magic also.
And for those 3 or 4 people maybe in the world who haven't heard my story before, see, I really suck at this. I have Michael's name on my name. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up, it's 54 years now that I've been practicing our ways. And then I spent 20 years researching a book, much like Grace, wanting to respond to some of the disinformation and misinformation out there, and along the way, just realized that if I was going to make any real difference in the world, I was going to have to do what everybody on our discussion today on this panel is doing, and that is sharing as generously as people shared with me, so that there's no secrets, there's no no keeping from the public this stuff that made my life better and richer. And I think we'll use that as a jumping off point. This conversation, by the way, is going to be just that, a conversation. We're not, for those who are watching, we're not interviewing our guests. They are guests in our home. This is as though we were all sitting at a table having coffee or wine, and talking about what our experience, what our spiritual paths mean to us. And since so much of folk magic comes out of that experience of suffering and hardship, I think one of the things that I want to share is something. I'm going to turn it over to Grace first, because it's something you touched on in a recent video, where you talk about the fact, and let's get this out there in the public first, that Italian folk magic and Sicilian folk magic are connected to, they're intersectional with, and they might inform our practice and when I say Italian American, I consider all of the Americas. I don't mean the US, but Italo-Canadian and Italian American in the United States, they inform us and inform our practice, but they aren't the same thing. So our grandparents, my grandparents came here in the first wave of immigrants between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But even while they were here, their practice changed, because they got here, they were discriminated against, they were persecuted, they were treated as less than, and so their magic was no longer what their parents' magic was. My great-grandmother, who I was lucky to know for the first few years of my life, practiced completely different from her children, from my aunts and my uncles. So Grace, why don't you start off, because I think you shared some really great insight, having gone back to the old country as an adult and throughout your childhood, and seeing those differences.
Okay, well, when for instance, your family, your ancestors came over the first wave, right? It was late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was a different world then. And they brought whoever they were, whatever they had, whatever their beliefs were, they brought them over. And that was a snapshot in time. And that's the thing that when I talk to people who want to recreate, or they want to reconstruct, or they want to reconnect to the Italian folk magic that's in Italy right now, even your grandparents, their Italy doesn't exist anymore. My parents, their Italy doesn't exist anymore. The second they left, they brought with them a snapshot of what it was culturally, traditionally, customarily, spiritually. They brought that snapshot with them, and that's what they fed and they nurtured when they came to the new country. And they didn't have their people, they didn't have their hometowns, they didn't have the same kind of community. They created new families, new communities. And a lot of things that I find what's very interesting is that in Italy, there's something called campanilismo, which means that it's the bell tower. And people who live around the same bell tower will be the same culturally, traditionally, spiritually, and all that. Whereas in America, in North America, outside of Italy, everyone views us as one big blob of, Italians, when we're not. Italy's made up of like 20 different republics. And that were unified. And still, it's like, for instance, you, Gianmichael, your Sicilian language is a language. It's not a dialect of Italian. Napoletano is not a dialect of Italian. It's its own language. So that's what I was that's what I was talking about the other day on my video, right? Is that, we can't, when wherever you start, you can't be too preoccupied about authentic and what is Italian folk magic, because it's diverse from town to town. It's diverse from family to family. And it's also informed by the people that we come in contact with, the people that our parents, our grandparents came in contact with, right? For instance, my uncle, who was from Naples, he had Cuban neighbors, and they cross-pollinated their practices between the Santeria and then whatever my uncle did. It became unrecognizable to his family in Naples. And can you imagine, like, the Cubans were also, their practice was informed by my uncle's practice. So that's why for me, it gives me to the whole authentic thing, because authentic starts with you. It's where you are. It has to be authentic to you, to your place in time, what you're in contact with, sorry.
And what speaks to you? Yeah.
Yeah.
E, how about from your perspective?
Well, from my perspective, I went through a lot of soul searching when I started to write my book, because I was desperately trying to pick apart some of these questions of what was true Italian American practice versus, for example, the practice that my grandmother might have picked up from her African American upstairs neighbors that she was best friends with when my uncle and my mother were growing up. There are many stories about them, but and also, how do I pick apart what mom and grandma did versus what I have been doing for 30-something years of my life now? And is what I do that's slightly different authentic? And the changes I've implemented that my mother and grandmother ended up adopting, well, does that make it more authentic? And you can really think yourself into knots when you start thinking that way. And what saved me was realizing that this is not a dead tradition. This is a living tradition. It has changed and transmogrified multiple times over the years. It will continue to change and transmogrify. God's willing, my daughter will make her own alterations to the things that she learns from me. And if she has children, their children may make changes. And that's part of why it's survived, is it has stayed applicable to each generation, and it has stayed applicable by changing. My grandmother had recipes and methodologies taught to her by her family that she could never do because she couldn't identify the plants in the United States that she needed. And so I learned them, but she doesn't know the name of the plant. She knows how to describe the plant, and they never found the plant. So she's never been able to do them. My mother's never been able to do them. I've never been able to do them. But she has made do by constructing other methodologies and techniques that worked in the United States. And if the practice of Italian American esoteric magic, folk magic, whatever you want to call it, is to persist into the future, it's got to change and develop and grow with each generation. Otherwise, it's not a living tradition. It's some dead practice in a textbook somewhere.
Well, that just it also parallels the food, right? It's like, you know, my parents, they immigrated here. They couldn't find the same food, they couldn't find the same greens, like you said, the same plants or whatever. So they had to just make do with what they found that they thought was, well, this is abundant and and it's there. We'll just use that, right? So
yeah, the food is a good example. I mean, there's so many foods that Americans and Italian Americans think is Italian food that doesn't exist in Italy. And you know, I mean, some of it exists now because of the commercialization, but they're not Italian foods, they're Italian American foods. And it doesn't that doesn't make it less authentic than just like the magical practices, because if it's what, you know, the way that I make my gravy is the way that my family made their gravy. And I know other people who make it completely different. And I know people who on Sundays they make sugo. They don't even make gravy. You know, they make a marinara or something like that, or some of them make a bolognese and stuff. And that's all the influence of where you landed in the United States, what you had access to. Yeah, what you had access to, what you had the money for. Yeah. You know, and so much of it, like I'm honestly just told Craig today, I think that because of stuff that's going on health-wise, we're going to switch it up on Wednesdays and not have macaroni or pasta anymore, because I want to stay away from the meat. And that's huge for me. I'm 60 years old. I've had every Wednesday has always been gravy. It's always the leftover gravy from Sunday, and there's a reason for it, and a reason that we do that. And it always gets the, you know, little piece of roast from the brodo, a little piece of this, a little piece of whatever, so we're not wasting anything. And I said we can still not waste, but we don't have to have like an abundance of meat in the, you know, on the dish. So Michael, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that there's such a rich tradition, even just coming from an African American point of view. My godfather, who's also Italian, Ernie, always reminded me that, you know, the African American community and the Italian community share so much in common, because from the earliest days we shared so much. You know, even the parts of the animals that we ate, like, you know, pig's feet is known kind of across the board, like, you know, and sharing those butchers and sharing our communities even so much in the early days, that there's such a unique cross-pollination between the communities, which I think has become lost in kind of the fascist kind of uptaking of the Italian American community now, where it seems to pit the African American community and the Italian American community against each other. But really, it's like, you know, we're like blood brothers, even in our own practices. And it's just like, you know, I see even so much from the hoodoo tradition, where the slaves had to adapt, you know, when they came to America, because they didn't have everything that they had in Africa, you know, so much of hoodoo is almost identical to the Italian American magical tradition, because we had to do the exact same thing. And so there's that beautiful kind of ebb and flow, where I had kind of my spiritual awakening in the Italian American context, but where it came kind of full circle when I delved back into my African American roots, where there's really very little distinction sometimes.
I agree.
Yeah, and you know what? I tell people, people have heard me tell this story before about my uncle Zio Leo Martello, who they always say, well, he wrote the book The Way of the Strega, and they forget because I mean, Zio Leo would have been, I don't know, something like 80 some years old now. Rest his soul. But he said to Margot Adler, everybody in that era that became big superstars in the esoteric community were full of shit. They all made up backstories. They all made up what Zio Leo wanted to do, and it gave my aunts and my grandmother and all them agita because they disagreed with his getting involved with Wicca. But he felt like he wanted to create a Wicca that was that fit the Italian American community that he was a part of. And that's his choice, and that's each of our choices. And so some of us may draw from a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Your practice may be eclectic, and even if you don't think it is, if you think you're a purist, I think you're nuts, because you're constantly exposed to different things. I know there are things that I do in my practice that that my aunt taught me, that my aunt's housekeeper, who was an African American woman, who for all intents and purposes was probably her half sister or stepsister. I don't know when the dad is the common one. She was that. And so it found its way. I mean, I can't find anywhere in my research where Italians wrote a person's name on a piece of grocery bag, brown paper bag, and then fold it up and put it in your shoe before you go into court. That's African American hoodoo. Right. But it's a part of our tradition. I mean, I remember my aunts doing it. I did it recently for somebody. It just becomes part of who we are, and it just seems so much more freeing to me to just say, this is my magical practice, this is my path, and this is what works for me, and I'm happy to share it with you. But you don't have to take any of it for as law, because it's not. I'm going to look at some of the comments here. We've got some questions and comments there. R. Rajic says, I love Italian folk magic book. So do I. See what else we got here. And so they say also, I'm Italian-Canadian. I was told you have to learn Malocchio on Christmas Eve for it to be effective. Is this really true?
I could speak to that. You want to go first, Dee?
I will go first, but I will go very quickly. I learned the Malocchio cure on an October afternoon in the middle of the day, and I asked my mother and grandmother that, and they were like, it wasn't even a concept for them. They had zero concern. Their biggest concern was arguing over what step went in what order, and oh, you never told me that, and yes, I did. And it was very chaotic, actually, and full of hilarity and not solemn at all.
Crazy.
I was taught it was July 1985, I think. I went to visit my grandmother's sister in the nursing home. My dad drove us from Connecticut to Massachusetts to visit her before she died, because she had to tell me how to do it. And it was just an afternoon in July. And
it works.
Yeah, and it works. It works. What makes it work is practice.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? Someone can show you how to remove Malocchio or how to check for Malocchio. And the only way you get good at it is by doing it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the only way that it works is when it works for you. You have to modify what you're taught, because otherwise it's just rote. You don't even know, you need a lot of practice, and you have to be exposed to it a lot in order to recognize that energy, to know when that energy needs to be removed.
Yeah, and you got to make it your own, you know, in every way, not just the steps you do.
Even the prayer and all that stuff. Everyone's so hung up.
They argued to the day that my aunt died, because one side of the family were very secular. My grandmother's side of the family, very secular, because of some of the stuff they were involved in Catholic folk magic, and the roles that they played in the old country in that. The other side of the family, my father's side, which is where my aunts and uncles were all from, they were very rooted in that intersectionality with Catholic conjure or Catholic folk magic. And so the San Siesto prayer is part of their tradition. My grandmother's, but the putting the oil holding the dish above the head was not. My grandmother's family, if you didn't put the dish above the head, then how are you going to know? And they had a completely different incantation that they did. And then my uncle would sit me down after they had their big fight, because they'd always want me to be there to hear the argument, because it was like a court case, you know. And they did it every summer. They had the same argument every summer, but it wasn't done mean. It was done like as a debate. And
it's
then
crazy. It gets very heated.
yeah. And then at night we would sit by the fire, and my uncle would say, "Now here's what you really have to know." And he would frame it all in terms of like almost hermeticism, and say it doesn't matter what you do. You want to hold it? He said, "I'll prove it to you next time somebody has Malakio. Hold a cup of coffee over their head, but do everything else the same."
Mm-hmm.
It worked. And then I realized, so I don't have to, carry with me everything that I need to do a diagnosis or a removal. I could do a diagnosis or a removal with whatever's there.
I can't even tell you the last time I pulled out a bowl of water and oil, man. It's like, I can't even tell you the last time I did it.
Here's a message from Jet Set Girl. I do believe that we all have an intuitive understanding of this knowledge. I became sober 3 years ago, and on finding my spiritual path, I found this channel. Congratulations on the sobriety.
Well done. More power to you.
And Megan Nightingale Tarot says, these ladies' books are two of my favorites. Mine too. I don't know how I even got your comment up there, Megan, but it was meant to be. So, all right, let's see. See, I told y'all I suck at doing two things at once like this. So here's another comment. As a Mexican Italian folk practitioner, I've noticed so many similarities between Southern Italian and Mexican folk magic, probably due to Spain's influence over both regions. Absolutely, we were talking about that before we came on, and there are some people who think that Sicilia was isolated and from quote unquote Italy. And as a Sicilian, I bristle because I consider all of Southern Italian, all of the kingdom of the two Sicilies are Sicilian, and they're not. Italy was colonized, and that changes things up. Just like coming to this country and finding out that you have an upstairs neighbor who's an esotericist, or I dated nothing but or mostly Puerto Rican and Black men, so I was exposed to a lot of Santeria. And Candomblé, and so my magical practice was informed by that. Even if I don't do their rituals, I ended up cultivating a close, as close of a relationship with La Santissima as I have with the Blessed Mother, because to me they're two sides of the same coin, and that was because of the exposures. So Sicilia was exposed to the Norman culture. It was exposed to the Basque culture, to the Arabic culture. Part of my ancestors come from Tunisia in Africa. So all of the, and Greek and Roman culture and all of those different cultures, and the Muslim occupation, the Ottoman occupation, all of that contributed. And if you ever get a chance, go to that country and see the gorgeous blending of architectures and art styles and foods that exist on the island, because that it's sort of a microcosm of the spiritual macrocosm.
I think what happens is, and we see this a lot on social media, these people who it's like, I want to reclaim my ancestry. I want to reclaim my ancestry. But what ends up happening is they try to kind of scale them down to one thing. Like, we try to make this kind of cultural and spiritual and magical reclaiming kind of the same thing as we understand it as kind of religious dogma. Like, that these are the rules, these are the parameters, this is what makes this, and this is what excludes this. But at the end of the day, none of us are islands. None of this exists in a vacuum. And, we're all made of the composites of things that influence us, and so it drives me absolutely wild of people on the internet who tried to kind of, and I have nothing against like cultural reclaiming. I have nothing against that. Like, you know, but at the end of the day, like, you know, we're not just one thing. Where our ancestors came from, we're never just one thing. Like, you know, it's not like this one kind of like golden egg that we're trying to replicate or whatnot. And it's just like, you know, even as a Black person, I've never stepped foot in Africa. It's not a part of my day-to-day life. It's not a part of my culture. You know, the Italian American stuff is more culturally relevant to me than whatever happens in Africa. And I think that there's a point where we have to see ourselves and our magic and our spirituality as the kind of these composite parts. And I think that we'll have a better fleshing out of who we are, and in that sense, have a better fleshing out of who our ancestors were.
Oh, Michael,
Go ahead.
Okay, something you said, Michael. It's the magical, it's our magical lineage.
Mm-hmm.
It's a spiritual lineage. It's not so much for me like, you know, ethnic or anything like. For me, it's a magical lineage and a spiritual lineage, and that is what makes that. That's what makes the tapestry of our practice.
okay. So the stream froze. I apologize to everybody. It'll probably take a second for that to catch back up. But it looks like we're still live. Is everybody else there?
Yes.
I'm here. You guys moved around now.
your cameras are frozen on the screen. Hopefully they do amazing stuff with this platform. So hopefully that'll refresh. Let me see if I move people, if that makes the cameras refresh.
If it's any consolation, I see everybody moving.
Yeah, I see everybody moving.
Oh, you do? Okay, good. Then it's just on my screen. So one of the things I'd like to do now is we'll start with Dee, and then we'll go to Grace, and talk about your books and what are the three, because I happen to think that both of these books are just wonderfully done. I'm not somebody to dole out compliments unnecessarily. You could just ask a lot of other authors that, but there's substance here. And what I always like to ask somebody who's written a book or books is, what were the takeaways, that the three things you want someone to take away when they read your book? And so Dee, I apologize. I'm going to put you on the spot first, and I'm going to put your book up on the screen while you're talking.
All right. That is an excellent question. I think that my three takeaways are, first, I spoke to my mother recently, and I asked her what she thought of the book finally. It took a while for me to ask her what she thought of the book. And she said, wow, you sure did get a lot in there. And I said, too much? And she said, no, this is wonderful, that everyone's going to get to read about this. So one takeaway I want people to have is, the gate's open, come on in, check it out. Try it out. These are the practices that my family know and love. And my mother and grandmother were enthusiastic about sharing these practices with all of my friends and anyone who was interested as I was growing up. And they were delighted anytime anyone expressed interest. So that's one takeaway. The second takeaway is that, kind of like with our discussion about the evil eye and tools, is that the tools you use in your folk magical practices should assist you. If the tools are getting in the way, if the tools are making it harder for you to accomplish your magic, then get rid of those tools and only use the things that are actually going to promote your concentration, your focus, and getting your magical work done. And the third thing would be, if at all possible, no matter what your background is, experiment with connecting with your ancestors. a lot of my magical practice has been completely taken over by my ancestors over the years, because working with them is so fulfilling. They are so willing to help when I ask for assistance. And I think that no matter what your background, whether you know who your ancestors are, whether you have been adopted, whatever the case is, there are people who are ancestors that are prepared to help you and that are on your side and want to see you succeed. So those would be my three takeaways.
Thank you for that. And I want to add to that for those who may be watching that may have just sort of gotten a little bit a little tense at that suggestion, because it's something I hear a lot, is remember that your ancestors don't have to be ancestors of blood. Some of us had some really unsavory ancestors. You know, I'm not saying write them off just because they were unsavory. There were ancestors in my life who just considered me that Nelly little Finocchio that they just didn't like me, who now have come to my assistance a couple times. But for the vast majority, the ones who've done unsavory stuff are not somebody I want to work with. So your ancestors can be ancestors of place. They could be the saints that are in your spiritual court, or the beings that are in your spiritual court. They could be the ancestors of tribe. As a queer person, a lot of my ancestors I consider to be people like Harvey Milk, Marsha Johnson, all, people who love you, and so can broaden your idea of ancestors beyond New Age, because Dee's right. There are people on your side who want to help you, who want to nudge you, who want to guide you. So Grace, talk to us about what your three takeaways would be.
What are my three takeaways? Okay, so my three takeaways are, if you can get all the information you can out of elders. Talk to elders, talk to you meet someone who's magical. It doesn't matter if they're the same, if they're Italian folk practitioners, or it doesn't matter what magical practice they have. Get them talking and learn from them, because that's where all the learning happens. A lot of it is it's passed down orally. You know what I mean? It's like, look, I love books like the next person, right? But like the really good stuff is when you get old people talking. So that's the first one. The second one is sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. The second one is, don't get too hung up on being perfect. Don't get too hung up on, is this the right way of, is this the right way with communicating with spirit? Is this the right way of doing the malocchio removal? Is this the right way to check for a curse? Don't get hung up on the right way. The right way is the way that works for you. The only way you figure that out is by doing it and messing up quite a few times. So don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and to make a mingiata, because that's the only way you're going to learn. And the last one is, oh my gosh, if you feel passionate about something, whether it's Italian folk magic or anything else, just throw yourself into it, man. Just do it. Just do it. Don't let other people gatekeep and tell you can't do something because you don't belong to the right club.
Mm-hmm.
So what about the question? I know this is a baited question, but what about the question of, oh, this is supposed to be a closed practice? Insert eye roll here. What do y'all think about that?
I think it's bullshit. It's not a closed practice. However, I'm also the one that says there's some things that are kept. It's not that it's a closed practice, but like I've said also on my channel, it's like, okay, I'm going to be more open to tell you about how to remove a malocchio, or how to consult with saints and and ancestors and stuff like that, than I am how to put a fattura on someone. You know what I mean? Like, it's like you have to be in my inner circle for me to teach you how to do a fattura, or even to remove a fattura.
If I agree 100%. Dee, how about you?
I can hear my grandmother in my head. It's probably not an esoteric thing. It's just probably a psychological thing of saying, how can keeping house be a closed practice? Because many of these things were so closely associated in my mother and grandmother's mind to just how you ran your household. that I mean, that would just boggle their minds to think that you wouldn't share those with friends and family, the extended family of your friend circle. So yeah, I do not consider anything that I share closed. Why would I share it if I thought it was closed? I just keep that to myself.
Also, I'm going to bring up something that this came up for like 20 years on the Stregoneria Italiana forum, 20 years ago, is that Italians are not good at keeping secrets. You know what I mean? It's like an Italian, anybody, especially Italian immigrants or whatever, if they can help you, they'll give you everything, you know, because they want you to learn and they want you to like be okay. So it's also part of the culture to be very open and to be very helpful and to want to share. Also because Italians want to know what the other people are doing. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Like I'll show you mine if you show me yours, kind of thing.
The 3 quickest ways to get information out there is telephone, telegraph, and telegumar.
There you go, telegumar. There you go.
So thank you both for that. I wanted to end us up on this question. We've got about 5 minutes to go. And that is just to kind of underscore for those who are watching, you know, somebody asked a question about how is this different from, or what do you think about the alleged connections to neo-paganism and all of that. And the way that I want to say this is if pagan practices work for you and you have members of your spiritual court that are Roman or Greek or Persian or African deities or other spiritual beings, then that's what's right for you. Like follow what's in your heart, what your gut tells you. But the main difference that I see is that for us, and it differs from every generation too, I think, because I'm older than probably everybody here put together. But I grew up.
I'm coming up right behind you.
Yeah. I grew up where my family, you know, took over a whole city block. So everywhere you went around the city block, they were all row homes. Was another member of the family. So all the kids played in the backyards because the backyards all faced in. That was a different culture than what my next youngest sister grew up with. And folk magic for us, we didn't call it stregoneria, we didn't call it fatocchieria, we didn't call it, I mean, if you called somebody a strega, it was just because you were belittling them. Like, I told the story on another show where on Christmas Eve, I was 6 years old. My grandmother whispered something to my aunt. I asked my mother what a strega butana is, and they were talking about the gumata in front, who I was fascinated with as a little queer boy. But she was, because she was well put together and she was definitely powerful. Like, we became good friends when I became a teenager. But all the old ladies believed that their husbands were messing around with her. And she said, have you looked at any of these uncles of yours? Like, do you think I'm really going to do that? No. But so strega was a pejorative. And it's a pejorative because the Catholic Church used it pejoratively in any language, whatever language you choose to look at. So for us, our magic was our worldview. It's not a religion. It's not, but it intersects for many of us with our religious practices, like Catholic conjure. Michael teaches a book, and will soon be writing teaches a course, and will soon be writing a book on Catholic conjure and Catholic folk magic. The way that we live is different from what neo-paganism is. It's, neo-paganism is a religion. Religious practices have, 4 walls. They have rules and regulations and are very strictly ritual in a lot of senses, where what we did was just the way that we lived our lives. And so you can't compartmentalize when a Sicilian or an Italian is practicing magic, because we're always doing it. Yeah. And we try to cultivate that mindfulness. So if you're just new to this path, whether you're Italian or Sicilian or not, just give it a shot. If I had to say there was, one major takeaway from my 2 books that are focused on this topic, I would say try cultivating mindfulness in your everyday life. Even if you're neo-pagan, if you're Norse pagan, if you're whatever, because when I tried to fit in with the neo-pagan community, because I have a lot of friends in that community, a lot of authors that I really respect and love, and I tried to do it with divination. I tried to read tarot cards using a traditional tarot, but I grew up using a Scopa deck. It's the only way I really know how to do effective. And I have a couple oracle decks that I work with, but Scopa is my go-to. And so all of the other cards in the tarot would screw me up every time I tried to do it, because then I had to remember something, because I didn't have the relationship to the deck that I have with my Scopa deck. Your magic is that same exact thing. Cultivate the relationships, and what works for you works for you. What doesn't, say, okay, now at least I know one thing that doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do something. I'm going to try something else, and maybe the something else doesn't work, but keep on trying and you'll find it. And if you cultivate that mindfulness of magic in every moment, then everything changes.
And like you said, don't give up.
Yeah. I'll leave it to the rest of you.
It doesn't work. So what? Move on to something else.
Yeah. If you've ever cooked a meal for the first time, sometimes it isn't good the first time, and you decide, or it isn't to your taste the first time, and you decide you've got to make something else. Anybody else want to jump in and give your closing thoughts?
Water's good, feels good, jump on in. Water's fine, jump on in. If I think sometimes people, unfortunately, they wait for someone or something to give them permission to do something or try something. And if you need permission, here's your permission from the universe. The universe is telling me to tell you to try it out. Try folk magic out if you haven't. And, it's all about experimentation, and it's all about those lived experiences and what you bring to the table as a unique, fantastic human being. So, just jump in and share your findings with the people that are interested too, because we all are learning from each other all the time.
Miguel.
And I think for me, as somebody who I think, and then it just goes out of my mind. I had something, now it's gone. But I think as somebody who, if I wasn't invited into the practice, that I may have not have been. So this is the invitation to those who might be looking or who might be curious, this is the invitation, this is the invitation to the table. And if you were looking for that invitation as somebody who you might feel outside of this practice, or you feel that this practice isn't for you, it's so important that I'm inviting you to the table. I'm inviting you to the cookout. We're gonna have the Sunday gravy with the fried chicken. It's gonna be that whole thing. Yeah. And so here we are.
Grace, any words of wisdom to wrap us up?
Words of wisdom. I think a lot of our practice is our relationship with our spirits, and no one can tell you you're doing that wrong. So however it is you connect with your spirits, and whatever spirits it is you connect to, then, that's the right way for you. The only way is when you get a result. The only way is when they answer back. No one can tell you, oh, you're doing it wrong, yet you're getting all this response and all this support from your spirit court. It doesn't matter if someone else is telling you doing it wrong. You're obviously doing it right. And I echo what Michael said. This is an invitation. Come on in. Join us.
Thank you all so much. And when I put everyone else back in the green room, if you don't mind, Grace and Dee sticking around, and Michael sticking around for a second for me to thank you personally after the show. We always like to wrap up the show with a message from the Charter for Compassion, because they're doing incredible work, and it's work that I think all of us can benefit from, considering these words and from applying them to our lives. So thank you, every one of you, for watching the program today. Keep the questions and comments going. thank you in advance for sharing this on social media, because we never know who might feel like they're alone out there. Someone said that, you know, what if your tribe no longer works for you and you're solo? As long as the three of us or the four of us are around, you'll never be solo. It doesn't matter whether this is your path or not. You have your own unique path. You have people there who care about you. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see everybody in a couple weeks.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions,
calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves.
Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures.
To dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there.
To honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being.
Treating everybody without exception.
With absolute justice, equity, and respect.
It is also necessary in both public and private life
to refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain.
To act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest.
To impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody.
And to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies.
Is a denial of our common humanity.
We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately.
And that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion.
We therefore call upon all men and women
to restore compassion
to the center of morality and religion.
To return to the ancient principle
that any interpretation of scripture
that breeds violence,
hatred,
or disdain
is illegitimate.
To ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information
about other traditions, religions, and cultures.
To encourage a positive appreciation
of cultural and religious diversity.
To cultivate
an informed empathy
with the suffering of all human beings,
even those
regarded as enemies.
We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world.
Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness.
Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries.
Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential for human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity.
It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable in the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.